In our study last time, we saw Sri Aurobindo's description of how that one superconscious existence represents itself here through a double process of two conflicting elements, one negative, one positive. And we have here a kind of a representative existence, a shadow, superficial, peripheral to that greater superconscious existence. And the relationship is that the superconscious existence holds this in itself, inspires it secretly, governs it omnipotently. And from within, where we are, if we were to be able to experience that superconscious existence, we would know it as immanent in this world, the Lord who inhabits all the creation, and we would know it also as ourself, that we are constituted of that, and all of our activities are also made of that. But as it is, there is as if a screen separating our experience of that superconscious existence, and so its influence in us and in this world is as if concealed, and so it secretly. That screen and the technology by which that screen is formed is what we read last time. He says, the mortal life is a dual representation of that, with two conflicting elements, negative and positive. Its negative elements of death, suffering, incapacity, strife, division, limitation, 6 of them, are a dark figure which conceal and serve the development of that which its positive elements cannot yet achieve. And so we are left with a world in which everything is bound in dualities, one side negative, one side positive. The positive is as if pushing always to achieve something which it can as if never reach. And I keep saying as if because remember, that superconscious existence is always here immanent. And yet the way it is structured here, we are bound within these two. So the positive is struggling, never seems to be able to achieve what it is trying to reach. The negative is at the same time concealing that which the positive is trying to reach. And at the same time it supports the positive in its forward element. And so he describes their play, and then we will look at each of these 6 in detail. He says, its negative elements are a dark figure which conceal that and serve the development of that which its positive elements cannot yet achieve. They conceal, at the same time they help to realize that. On the other side, the positive elements suggest what the Brahman is, but never are what the Brahman is. So they are not that, as much as the negative is not that. But in the way they are, the positive, they seem to point towards what that could be or what that is. The error we make is to take the positive and say, this is that, and in order to realize that, we have to exaggerate this. And so the negative at that point pops in and breaks our false formation, false understanding or false effort. And in so doing, it helps to get to something which is more true. At the same time, the negative, by denying, is concealing and actually represents the opposite of that in representation. Just as much as the positive attempts to represent what that is, the negative attempts to represent the opposite of that. And we will look at all 6 in terms of the pairs, but for the moment we understand the larger relationship. The positive elements suggest what the Brahman is, but never are what the Brahman is. Although their victory, the victory of the gods, is always the victory of the Brahman over its own negations. So when the positive moves forward and overcomes the negative, it is the victory of the gods. The full sense of what the gods are, we have briefly looked at in the Isha Upanishad, but also in this text it will come again in a later chapter, where, and we touched upon this last time, when we read the text from Savitri, where he says, where Sri Aurobindo writes how the soul's outlook, the soul's vision, the soul's conception of what can be becomes the itinerary of the gods. The gods here are the powers of the divine in the manifestation who are always pushing forward evolution. And so every time that the positive overcomes the negative, it is the victory of the gods and always the victory of the Brahman over its own self-negation. So it's as if in the negative, the Brahman has chosen to negate himself. In the positive, the Brahman has chosen to represent himself, but in the domain of duality. And so the negative serves to remind us in a different way of what the positive is reminding us of. The negative reminds us by saying it's not possible. So consider a child who is trying to walk, and somebody keeps saying, not possible, you cannot walk, you cannot walk. What would happen normally if a child is not sufficiently developed, he might say, oh yeah, you're right, and stop making an effort. But if the child has some push of the positive, he will say, let me show you how well I can walk. And so the negative acts as a goad. By denying, it makes you aware that something is possible. The fact that death exists makes us think of how can we overcome death? How can we attain to immortality? You will see scientists today are spending so much effort in trying to extend human lifespan. And only because death is almost like a compulsion that we start wondering, is there a way around this compulsion? If it was not, suppose human lifespan could pretty much continue as long as you wanted, and only when you got fed up you would say, all right, I want to switch bodies, take on something else. You would not worry about overcoming death. But in the first effort, the scientists are trying to overcome physical breakdown of the body, extend the physical lifespan, assuming they succeed. And it is quite likely that one could find ways to regenerate parts of the body or even the entirety of the body. There are such means, in fact, suggested too in the Ayurvedic knowledge. But if you could regenerate the body, eventually you would reach a point where you would say, I'm fed up with this. I want to change. And you would realize somewhere the mind ages even when the body does not. And something gets fed up with the mind's incapacity of being able to be plastic. Or even if somehow we were able to stretch, the limitation of the particular form and personality in which this mind-body complex is made, that itself would eventually become a suffocation, and we would say, I want to change this and take up a new personality, a new aspect. And so the sense of what we are seeking is not merely exaggeration of the current form of our life. It is not making our life bigger. It is not uploading our life into some trans-human computer system where we might be immortal. We would still be limited somehow. It is to find something fundamentally different where we are no more bound in these limitations. And that is the sense of the true Amritam, the immortality of that higher existence. And you see in this example how death acts as a goad, challenging, compelling life to attempt immortality. But every time life misrepresents immortality in terms of whatever limitation it can currently conceive of, death comes and breaks and forces a higher conception and a higher conception, until at some point we wake up and say, it's neither that nor this, it is something fundamentally different, and we transcend and discover that of which these are positive and negative figures. And when that consciousness is acquired, one is able to play with the masks of life and death. If necessary, extend the form as long as you like. If necessary, discard the form without losing continuity of consciousness. And then death and apparent sense of limitation of life are just tools that you play with. And so it is for all six, which we will shortly look at in detail. But let's see the sense of the positive. The victory of the gods and also the victory of Brahman over its own self-negation. Always the self-affirmation of his vastness against the denials of the dark and limiting figure of things. And this dark and limiting figure of things is not just in the negation, but even in the positive affirmation, you find the limitation. You find our life is not that life, it is still a dark figure of that superconscious life. And so he says, still, it is not this vastness merely, but the absolute infinity which is Brahman itself. And therefore, within this dual figure of things, we cannot attain to ourself our highest. The therefore here is very important. Because the nature of the vastness is not merely a vastness within the domain of duality. It's not merely life becoming so vast, so long in duration, or so vast in its impact. It's not that which makes it immortal. So there is an absolute. And therefore, as long as you're in the duality within the domains of the relatives, we cannot attain to our highest. We have to transcend in order to attain. Our pursuit of the positive elements of this existence, our worship of the gods of the mind, life and sense, is only a preparatory to the real travail of the soul. And we must leave this lower Brahman and know that higher if we are to fulfill ourselves. So now comes the full sense of the journey. There is an initial preparation, and then there is the real part of the journey. The initial preparatory journey is often attended by a dominance of the negative. So in the early stages of emergence of life in evolution, you will see death or the breakdown of life is the greater power. Life struggles to organize itself, collapses. Again struggles, again collapses. Eventually it comes into its own and is able to hold a precarious balance. Then it quickly consolidates its strength and now takes a form that is able to fight against, defend against all that pushes into it as death. And that's when we see evolution picking up. And that evolution grows until it is able to consolidate all the layers that it can in the human being. The body itself we are able to defend against the cold, against the heat, against all the dangers which would have broken the body. Our life energy we are able to energize again by various means. Our mind we are able to organize, but at some point now with the awareness of the mind, we can begin to glimpse that of which these are dark figures. That's when the real journey begins. And so he says, our pursuit of the positive elements is only preparatory to the real travail of the soul. And we must leave this lower Brahman and know the higher if we are to fulfill ourselves. And he explains later, the leaving of the lower Brahman is not an abandonment of this life. It is an abandonment of this consciousness which is bound in duality. The recovery of the higher Brahman is a recovery of the consciousness by which now we can experience mind, life, body, senses on the basis of that immortality. He gives an example. We pursue, for instance, our mental growth. We become mental beings full of an accomplished thought power and thought acquisition. Dhiraha. The word in Sanskrit from the verse earlier, and we will see this in detail later. In order that we may, by thought of mind, go beyond mind itself to the eternal. That's the whole point of developing our mind, that our mind becomes so capable that by this power we may go beyond the mind itself to the eternal. Is the life of mind and senses is the jurisdiction of death and limitation. Beyond is the immortality. So our consciousness transcends the mind to the immortality, and that consciousness inhabiting the mind, life and body now begins to experience and manifest that superconscious. So this we will come back to in further exploration later. Now with this background of the relationship between the positive and negative, we look at the 6 pairs. Death opposing life, both pointing to immortality. Death pointing to immortality by denial of life. It says, you cannot do, and therefore we are forced to think of what is it that I cannot do? The immortality. Life gives you as if a partial sense of what is immortality. Oh, I can be forever. And the relationship, as you see, initially death predominates, life is weak. Later life predominates, death only comes to break the limited forms of life. Where is immortality? If you notice, stepping back from both, life currently is able to experience immortality through the gateway of death. Every time that our personality becomes too rigid, too suffocating, there is this passage of discarding the rigid surface personality and the life taking on a new form of personality, more plastic, more open, more expressive of your current evolutionary development, using that personality now to evolve further, and at some point where the shell of personality becomes again too rigid, unable to keep up with the current growth of consciousness, it sheds that, takes up a new personality more suitable for this consciousness, and again grows with that. It's as if at each step upon yourself to live and experience the material world is only what you can take in your current development of consciousness, but it itself cannot grow beyond a point, and so you discard that, take a new material on that level, grow to the next level that it can go to, and so on. Looking at it this way, death is the means by which life is able to experience its true sense of immortality, of being able to continue without limits. But when the consciousness is able now to break free of this duality, the consciousness now experiencing immortality does not need anymore this device. That consciousness, being itself of Amritam, is infinitely plastic as the creative consciousness which formed this whole universe. Everything in the universe is formed out of that, and therefore everything in my personality being formed of that directly, I do not need the mask of death or the limited form of life. I have the Amritam. I can still use the processes available for changing forms if so needed, or I can directly simply will my forms to glow and flow as they choose, as my consciousness needs. And therefore, the Madhakan observes, in the supramental body, there is no more the compulsion of death. You can, because the body is plastic, you can extend the form and make it as expressive as you choose. But that itself, the form itself evolves. But now, because it is plastic, it does not need that passage of breaking and replacing form. But it can still choose to do that freely, without losing continuity of consciousness. And so death and life, immortality hiding itself from life in the figure of death. The next is delight hiding itself in the figure of suffering. So on the negative side you have suffering, on the pleasure seems to be what we are looking for, except every time that I push the border, the limits of pleasure, there is a breakdown. I suffer. I enjoyed this food so much, I went on eating until something breaks down. And now I puke because I cannot take it. Or the pleasure itself, when it is of a sensory pleasure, it overloads the nerves and breaks down the body. The body falls back in exhaustion and suffers. Every time that we pursue any kind of pleasure in any activity, there is always a kind of a limit beyond which the system has to go back into rest. But that movement of rest is an extreme of suffering. When people get addicted to any activity or any form of any activity or any even drugs, you find these cycles. Something which compels you, the drive of the addiction, and then something which follows in the negative immediately after. Cycles become more and more extreme until the whole machinery of your system breaks down. Obviously, therefore, pleasure is not it. And yet it seems to point to something. And the word we use here is ananda, which is the main of dualities. It is not available to a consciousness which is finite or fragmented. Just as immortality, amritam, is not available to a consciousness which is fragmented, because the very fact of being fragmented means there's something else bigger which can overwhelm and therefore destroy, or against which this is insufficient. Or as that changes, or this environment changes, this form cannot keep up with the change, it has to break down in order to take a new form. So limitation means life and death are always together. Immortality is available only to a consciousness which is infinite. And the same here with delight. Delight is available only to a consciousness which is infinite, and therefore pleasure and suffering are no more experienced by it as dualities. And the experience there of delight is neither pleasurable nor suffering, but something which takes in an intrinsic joy behind all forms equally. In the record of yoga, Sri Aurobindo describes in his diary notes how this transition begins to take place even in his physical consciousness. And he describes how at first the physical consciousness becomes immune to pain. So he can walk at midday on the hot stone, bare in the sun, and not feel the pain. But he does feel something. It's not insularity. It's not a hardening. He feels something. And what he feels increasingly becomes a kind of a different color of delight. And so on with all the senses. Everywhere you look, everywhere you see, you begin to perceive something which is behind the forms. And as if you are transcending the dualities. But notice how suffering is the goad that directs us to find that which is not suffering. And so pleasure becomes the positive goad. When pleasure itself being the wrong form, suffering comes to break it, to remind us that there's something else, something greater. So you will see often when we are growing up as teenagers, we chase after things which we feel satisfy us. And then we experience the opposite, the dissatisfaction or the recoil. And at some point you say, well, this is not it. And you seek a higher grade of satisfaction and a higher grade. So as teenagers, often the focus is more on a sensory gratification or a vital gratification. Oh, people adore, people adulate, I am so great, I control so much. And very quickly that passes and you find a deep satisfaction which is intrinsic not dependent on what people think and say. I read this book, I sing this song to myself as an expression of my joy. That is so satisfying. And the whole thing shifts to a finer and finer grade. Until at some point you realize, and often this is in late age, Mother says at 80, that's when you know truly how to live. But of course the body is unable to support. But that's generally the time when all the existing drives of your instinct are no more your primary interest. They are no more your primary motivations. You don't care too much what people think and what people say. You are not attached to any particular form because you've made the mistake of chasing after the things which you were attached to and of losing them and of gaining greater things after and losing them also. And you are no more craving. What comes to you, you learn to enjoy. What goes from you, you learn to enjoy. Knowing that something else will come, which will be a different joy. And that's around the time when you begin to truly know how to live. And that's when you're beginning to taste the true sense of the underlying delight. But the true delight will only come when the consciousness breaks out of this positive-negative play and experiences its completeness. And that's where it aligns with the superconscious existence and knows the true sense of Ananda. In the Veda, we've used this image many times, they describe how the sap of life is first extracted from all the experiences. So the image is given, life is like a forest. All the plants are our experiences. But if you really want the Ananda, the sap of the juice of immortality, then you have to take all these creepers, crush them, extract their juice. Meaning, it's not the form of the experience, it is what is inside them that you have to first catch. And then that juice has to be strained, refined, purified, removing from it all the distortions which your own desires and drives and compulsions and attachments bring into it. And that purified juice is then offered to the gods. It's the wine, but it's offered to the gods, not yours. As long as you claim enjoyment, it will fail. You will not get to the delight. It is when you can remove yourself from the picture and allow that which is not you, the pure consciousness, to enter in relation with the pure consciousness in the other. All sense of limitation of ego and claim removed. Consciousness meeting consciousness. That's when that consecrated wine is drunk and is the delight, the soma, which gives the ananda. When you look at the deeper sense of it, it does not matter which experience of life. In the sap of every wine is the soma, but it is not soma. It is the sap. And the sap has to be strained, it has to be extracted, it has to be purified, it has to be consecrated, and then you can enjoy the true soma. And that is the sadhana, the yoga that is done within. And so, suffering and pleasure compel by this kind of double movement towards delight. And remember, just as with life and death, first, our early strivings are predominated with sufferings. The smaller our consciousness, the less mature, the more developed, the more the sense of overwhelming suffering. The more we grow in consciousness, the more we begin to enjoy. But it is more of a pleasurable enjoyment. You'll see more mature people in the same situation will say, oh yeah, that happens. In a crude vocabulary, they will say, oh, the shit happens. Okay, you move on. But that attitude that you can accept when things go wrong and say, well, such things happen and you move on, that can only happen when you have grown enough through the early sufferings. I often point out that it is only a person who has gone through the experience of losing everything who can now face life without fear. Because he has lost everything. He knows he can survive it. He knows he can rebuild. Okay, so what if I lose everything again? I know I am not dependent on those things. The same problem you will see, and these are such profound insights when you apply them to smaller situations in life. The same thing you will see when you observe people starting a new project. A startup rapidly grows, rapidly is successful in innovation, precisely because you have nothing to lose. You're starting from zero, you can experiment freely. The moment they come into their own, then now they have things they can lose. We've built up a reputation, we've built up a name, we've built up a skill set, and we have now so many investors expecting so much from us. We can't take a risky decision. And immediately the scope begins to narrow. The plasticity becomes less, becomes more and more rigid. And that's when innovation fades away. They get hardened eventually and stuck in a narrow groove, and somebody else comes and does the very things which we knew we had to do but didn't have the courage to do because we would lose everything. And so the moment you move, initially you have this passage where you can't take all risks because you have nothing to lose. And that's why I said a person who has been through that experience of losing everything can stand up before the whole world and stand for what's right without fear. Or a person who has got free of this attachment to suffering and enjoyment, standing or leaning back on that consciousness which belongs to the superconscious existence. You can look at this play and say, all right, I make the most of whatever situation comes. And you neither suffer or are repelled by suffering, nor chase after pleasure. You accept and move forward. There is a prayer that Sri Aurobindo wrote, which is called Radha's Prayer, which was used by the mother in one of the plays. And in that, there is this line which goes something like this. Whether thou choosest for me life or death, pleasure or suffering, happiness or pain, all that comes to me from thee will be welcome. Each one of thy gifts will be for me a gift divine, bringing with it the supreme felicity. And this is the supreme felicity, the delight. It's only when you can accept the dualities equally as coming from the divine, accepting when they come, when they are necessary. Obviously, you don't chase after them. Accepting when they come, using them as your means of growth equally, that you have the gateways of the true felicity which open. And the secret is given here. You view them not as things to be repelled or craved after, but as the spectrum of the experience given by the divine for your growth. So the next duality he refers to is, so let's summarize this. This line was delight hiding itself from pleasure in the figure of suffering. The next duality is infinite force hiding itself from finite effort in the figure of incapacity. So you see, the early stages of our evolution is incapacity. Something inside wakes up as an instinct to nudge forward a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, gradually building capacity. And what develops is finite effort, which tries to overcome the incapacity. So notice how initially it is the push of the instinct which builds the basic form. Once the basic form is made, the drive is now to overcome your own limitations. So let's say, as a child, you grew up pretty much not knowing how you grew. Once you have come into your own, you realize, oh, I'm not capable of this and I don't like it, and now I consciously overcome that disability. But the same thing pretty much happens in the larger human evolution. As we emerge out of animal consciousness, we realize, oh, My body is not strong enough. My body is not supple enough. The human body is not sufficiently capable of. And let's push the envelope of our limits. If you look at the last 100 years, a little over 100 when the Olympics were restarted, every time that the Olympics take place, every 4 years, the human body is pushed, crossing its own limits. Every time you have new world records, lifting heavier, jumping higher, expressing greater suppleness, running faster. I think the motto of the Olympics is these 3 words: faster, higher and stronger. But every time you're breaking the barrier. And you notice something very strange happens. Once the barrier is broken, suddenly in the next Olympics, many are able to break the same barrier. When Nadia Comaneci, I think, first broke the record and got a 10 out of 10 in gymnastics, the display board did not have the capacity to display 10 out of 10 because they never thought it would be possible. And so it showed 0. The digit for 1 didn't exist. And it showed 0. Poor lady, she started crying. But the level of perfection attained was such that you could not find anything which could be called a flaw. And immediately after the next Olympics, there were several who broke that, and more and more. And pretty much it came to a standard where you had to be able to come close enough to that in order to even enter the Olympics. They used to say it was impossible to run 1 mile in 4 minutes. The 4-minute mile was the dream, like the reference of the absolute, something you can never reach. And a few years ago, somebody actually broke that. He managed to run the mile in 4 minutes. It was an extraordinary achievement with long preparation. Interestingly, within a month, 2 or 3 people broke it. Within the year, several dozens had broken it. You can see here something extraordinary happening. When one, in the evolutionary, this cutting edge, the edge is sharp, narrow, 1 or 2 people break through. But the moment that is cut through, all the rest of humanity very quickly is pulled in. And so the initial effort struggling against incapacity was unconscious. The moment we come into our own, we start now taking charge of it, and we make finite efforts and push and push and push. How far? Potentially unending. 1 mile in 4, you will have 1 mile in 3 and 3/4 minutes, and so on. How far could it go? There's a point where we say biologically it is not possible. Well, 100 years ago they said, with all the study of biology, human beings cannot run faster than a horse. Your body will fall apart. Of course, we have not only run faster than the horse, we have run far more. Every time, the plasticity of the biology itself is being pushed. How far can it go? Potentially, there's no reason why you can ever draw a line. But how long will that take? That we don't know. It might take longer, or it might be faster. But it would actually happen spontaneously, naturally, when we are able to transcend the limitation of this finite force itself and able to engage infinite force directly. And at that point, poof, you can do it. Infinite force is what they are pointing to. Incapacity reminds you that there is such a thing, however far it may appear. Finite force nudges you towards it, but finite force is not it. Finite force, observe what it does. It takes a finite piece and pits itself towards something or against something. As long as it is finite, it can never reach it. Incapacity will follow. There's always a failure. And so the two go hand in hand. Life uses death to sustain itself. Death reminds life of its insufficiency. Pleasure uses suffering to remind itself that there's something greater. The same way finite force is accompanied by incapacity. Only now your definition of incapacity each time is rising, reminding you something greater and something greater. When the consciousness steps back, transcends this duality, And here in our human body, in our human frame, we are able to enter in tune with a higher consciousness which is infinite and let that work through us. When it acts, it is smooth, spontaneous, instantly effective. The effort of finite effort is no more there. But to be able to come to that stage where you can engage with and allow that to act through you as an instrument, you need to use finite effort to develop your capacity. But in the process, increasingly the finite effort makes less effort to do the thing. It makes effort to create the state in which the thing can be done by a higher transcendent force. So the direction of the effort itself changes to create a condition of receptivity where that can act. In fact, we can complete the discussion by turning back to the Olympic gymnasts. Increasingly, the training given to Olympic gymnasts and athletes is precisely to remove oneself from the effort. You are taught today, and these are all yogic principles which are being brought, to remove first all agitation. Second, to remove you, the doer, and enter the experience of what they call the flow. It's just using a different vocabulary. What flows? Not you. Something else flows through you and does it through you. You are not there. Even you have the sense of dissolving and something else acts. I remember after I had completed my studies in the ashram school, I still continued a few activities in the physical training program and joined certain competitions which were not too physically strenuous. And one of the things I had done was I joined the discus throw in the athletics competitions, and I took the 1 kilo discus, which is very light. There's no strain on the body. You can focus on the perfection of the movement and the form of the throw. And so on the day of I was still physically not so strong, and so I was in the 3rd division always. And then on the day of the competition, I threw with effort the first time. It was good. Second time, it was okay. And at the 3rd time, I said, okay, now I've done my best. I can't do better. My body is already strained. Now let me just forget myself. And I entered a state which I can only use the vocabulary of meditation. I took and I forgot myself and just let the flow happen. And I felt the body move so smoothly, effortlessly. There was no strain of the muscles. There was no me. And something in my mind went, oh, there's a problem now. The body went smoothly, it spun and it threw. And it threw so far, and I felt no pressure of the muscles. It threw so far. Obviously, it went well beyond the 3rd division and entered what would have been normally a throw in the 1st division. But I felt nothing. And that was the beauty of it. Of course, the was because it created a misunderstanding. People thought I had joined the competition simply to win a prize. It was not the case at all. And after that, I had to stop going. But the thing was, the experience was such. You felt nothing at all. The body just flowed like a stream of water in the ocean. It was not even a sense of separateness. There was no sense of personal effort. It was just a flow, as if something moves, the universe moves, and it throws, and that's it. But that's the kind of experience which is accessible to all of us with a little bit of effort, and is consciously taught among gymnasts. And it is that which allows them to reach that level of perfection. The moment something within you claims, I am doing, I am making effort, immediately comes this split. My effort versus the incapacity. Will it be good enough? Will I satisfy? Will I fail? Even the slightest tremor of that thought will bring in a little bit of distortion. You dissolve yourself, erase yourself completely, and the flow happens. And often you will find when people experience it the first time, it's often difficult to tell somebody how to do it. When they experience it the first time, it's when they're trying the least. The day they are most tired, they think, today I can't make the effort anymore. They don't try, and then it happens. So the skill as it is taught, they tell you, don't try. And of course, they use other psychological and yogic methods to teach them how to enter states of self-effacement and so on. So, incapacity, finite effort. That's the duality, he says. Infinite force hiding itself from finite effort in the figure of incapacity. The next duality is fusion of love hiding itself from desire in the figure of strife. And so we see the same pattern here. Wherever there is strife, we yearn to get beyond strife. We desire and we struggle. In that desire, what are we seeking? Joining with that which we desire. Fusion of love. Of course, you never reach that, because in the very act of trying and struggling with your desire, you create a tension within yourself and with the very thing to which you are craving. And so inevitably, the strife comes back in a new form. You notice when teenagers first fall in love, there is this complete sense of everything is perfect, everything is going to work out. And you have a glimpse of an ideal of fusion of love. But very quickly the strife emerges in little things. And then it creeps in, and eventually suddenly the whole thing breaks. Afterwards, when you look back, you realize, oh yeah, that was almost an obsession. You caught one narrow point and thought that was all. And when the rest of your personality meets personalities of others, of course you find so many things are out of sync. But you cannot experience a perfect alignment, a perfect attunement on all parts unless you're already one. And if you're already one, there's no question of entering in a relation. So the whole thing is, in the domain of duality, the whole thing is impossible. Perfect harmony, perfect fusion in love is not possible. Because there will always be something, and even if it's a small thing, that is the crack through which everything else can fall apart. And yet there is this ideal, true love. And what's the sense of true love? You experience an oneness of some kind. A oneness which is not a compromise, which is not partial. And yet you can have a relationship in that oneness. If you think about it now from the higher perspective, from a deeper understanding, the only thing that exists in the universe with which you can have oneness without compromise is the consciousness of that of which you are an image. Anything else in the universe is a different image. And so the only thing you can relate to perfectly, which will never misunderstand, which will always be in perfect harmony with you as you change, is the divine consciousness. Often it happens among human beings. You have a perfect relationship, but 10 years down the line, one has grown more, the other has grown less, you're out of sync. But here you have a relationship with something that is always in perfect alignment with you as you grow. And as you aspire to grow beyond your limitations, it is already there and is able to meet you from that higher status that you seek for and help you to attain to it. It's not somebody who's walking with you, it's somebody who's at the same time ahead of you and helping you grow beyond yourself. And if you fall back, it is still there with you wherever you are. And so that is the one perfect relationship you can have with the consciousness which is itself complete, including you in all your possibilities. And that's why one is often told in the spiritual life that everything else and only that relationship with the divine will finally satisfy. And so in our human relationships, we may approach that when we set ourselves in relation to that as the basis of our relationship. And this is the concept of Deva Sangha, the spiritual community. That everybody is consciously aspiring to the spiritual growth, and together we form, our relationship is based on that common aspiration for the divine. And therefore, our love for the divine reflects in our love for each other. And to that extent, it's possible to experience a desireless love. It is not yet a fusion of love, but it is the closest that we can in our current evolution of the true love or the divine love as it can manifest in us. The moment that shifts you, it breaks the sync. And if not now, eventually some cracks will form and the things break. And so you can be in perfect attunement with others when we are all equally turned, looking towards the source of the love rather than seeking the love within each other. That's the secret of true love in human life. And so strife, desire, forming this relationship, leading always pointing to that fusion of love. He says, fusion of love hiding itself from desire in the figure of strife. Next, unity hiding itself from acquisition in the figure of division. As long as we are divided, we need to get something more. We have to acquire. As long as we have to acquire, in the very act of taking in, you're taking in something else and having to join it with something which was already there. And there is division. So you see the two go hand in hand. Within the very process of acquisition is division, and division compels you to acquire. What is it that all this is pointing us to? An underlying unity. If you take a sheet of paper, you can draw any number of lines on it. Call those patches that you have cut out by any number of names. Among them, the patches will always experience division and the need for acquisition. But the paper underlying will always be one. Although it will be the same paper, in each of those forms it will be differently represented in each of them, and yet it will be the same paper. And it is in this sense that unity exists in us, in the consciousness of that superconscious existence. It does not contradict the play of multiplicity. You can draw all the lines you want, but the underlying paper will still be one, indivisible. And you can play with the divisions. So, division is an appearance which compels acquisition, both of which together remind us of this deeper, transcending consciousness of unity. And it is in that consciousness, when you have the true unity, that you can have infinite multiplicity, the full play of maximum colors of differences, including even oppositions, without them ever entering into strife, conflict, or suffering. And so, unity hiding itself from acquisition in the figure of division. Acquisition will never get you to that. It is by stepping back from this process that you will acquire the true unity. And last, all of these things, life, pleasure, finite effort, desire, acquisition, they're all growing towards everything, full infinity, right? So, last is infinity hiding itself from growth in the figure of limitation. The moment you feel limited, you want to grow. The moment you attempt to grow, there's a point beyond which you're not able to cross the limitation. And so there's always this struggle, a positive forward movement, something breaking always your great achievements. They all point to something which is essentially infinity. And infinity is not acquired by exaggerating finiteness. Infinity is not the sum total of finite things. It is something fundamentally transcending. It can express itself through finitenesses without losing its infinity. I've shown this many times as an example. If you take a sheet of paper, you can take a finite piece and a finite piece. This is longer, this is shorter. But you can map them by parallel lines. Each point here has exactly one point here. Each point here has exactly one point here. Okay? So the number of points here is infinite. Between any two, you can put any number of finer points. The number of points here is infinite. But this infinity is larger than this infinity, visually. This is big, this is small, this is finite. Concealing inside is infinity. You can take any object in the world. Inside its finite appearance is an infinity concealed. And all the finitenesses you can map inside another larger object. And so all the finitenesses of the world can be mapped into this underlying infinity. The infinity can hide itself inside all the finitenesses. It still remains infinite, indivisibly infinite. The divisions are an appearance. So limitation and growth lead us towards that, or point towards that, and the transcendence gives us the experience of the infinite. So here we have, in sum, the 6 dualities using which the larger, greater superconscious existence conceals itself from this inferior existence which is taking place inside. It is immanent in us, but we cannot see it anymore because of this screen. This screen has been called Maya. But Maya, loosely, popularly described as illusion, is not illusion really in the original sense of the word. The root sense of Maya is to measure out. Maya is the measuring out. That which measures out finite appearances, which measures out the play of dualities out of something which is fundamentally indivisible, which is fundamentally infinite, which is fundamentally one, which is fundamentally fusion of love, infinite force, delight, immortality, unity, infinity. Out of that, this appearance of death, life, suffering, pleasure, incapacity, finite effort, strife, desire, division, acquisition, limitation, growth. It measures out, and so creates an appearance of something which is not really the underlying truth. In that sense, a power of illusion. But its fundamental power is a power of creation. To create the very opposite of that superconscious existence. You will recall the passage we read last time from Savitri. Why the soul wants to enter this adventure, why it wants to experience this. And for that purpose it puts out its own power of screening, of veiling, to create, to manifest this possibility through which chance, surprise, fate, struggle, limitation, etc. can be experienced by a consciousness which is itself free of all these. And so we entered this life, and so within this life we grow and wake up to our own home, our own original state, and awakening to it, we begin to express it, manifest it in this world. Where now that little light that this divine can bring in fights against the darkness and overcomes, brings into this impossible world realities or ranges of possibilities which are inconceivable to it. And so that's the nature of the evolution. Mother describes how at first evolution is this struggle to wake up. Once it enters the supramental consciousness where there is no more darkness, evolution does not end. It continues unendingly, infinitely, but it changes direction. Now it manifests truths of the divine into the world. Things which could not be, which could not exist in this world, are now brought into manifestation, and newer possibilities expressed, always with an underlying immortality, delight, freedom of infinite force, fusion of love, unity and infinity in every expression. And so the larger picture is complete by creating or manifesting a world of duality where there is a possibility of infinite growth. The Absolute can take birth in it in increasingly perfect, more complete, with an infinite evolution of a divine self-discovery and self-manifestation. We are in that transition where we are just emerging out of the dualities to discover our potential as co-creators to manifest those divine possibilities. And Sri Aurobindo says, so many billions of years of awakening and struggle of awakening can be justified only if what has to follow is something so extraordinarily beautiful that all of these billions of years of struggle are justified. And we are at that point of transition. That's why this period is so important. That's why this lifetime is so important. And Mother reminds us, it is worth it in this life to leave aside all the other things, which we have done millions of times before. To leave aside all those things and focus on this purpose. And yes, we also play with those things a little bit, but we should not lose sight of this larger focus and the possibility that is now. When all of nature has readied herself, preparing for these thousands of years for this great leap. And all of nature has readied herself and is attempting this leap. And from above there is the response of the divine assisting nature in this great leap. And we are here, and we can choose to be on the cutting edge of this great leap. Those who broke those barriers in the Olympics in their physical possibilities were those on the cutting edge in humanity. For that purpose, we can be on the cutting edge for something even more profound in our consciousness, to awaken to this greater superconscious existence. And therefore, the refrain of the Kena Upanishad, know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. We can meditate on this briefly and we continue the text next Sunday.